Shortly before midnight on July the 22nd, 1991, two Milwaukee police officers were flagged down in their patrol car by a man with a pair of handcuffs dangling from one wrist. The police had no idea that this bizarre encounter would lead to the arrest of one of the most prolific serial killers in US history.
That night, people were afraid. People were whispering under their breaths, it was the devil. It's the devil.
The man had escaped from a small one-bedroom apartment on North 25th Street. When the officers went to investigate, they found themselves in a living nightmare.
They saw the body parts, and then one of the officers said he heard a scream. Then he realized later he was the one who screamed when he saw the body.
Without detection, 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 young men across a 13-year period.
He hasn't got the same level of repulsion and shock at dead bodies or mutilated bodies that most of us have. It was just another aspect of his life.
Jeffrey Dahmer had etched his name in history as one of the world's most evil killers. The name Jeffrey Dahmer has become synonymous with evil. Between 1978 and 1991, he killed 17 young men and boys by drugging them before strangling them to death. As the revelations of the murders came to light, it was the behavior of Dahmer once he'd killed his victims that really stunned the world, with stories of necrophilia and cannibalism. The first journalist to arrive at the crime scene was Annie Schwartz.
It wasn't a gory crime scene. It was really quite antiseptic. It was a very simple one bedroom with a kitchen and a living room, and it looked like a regular single guy lived there. There's some dishes in the sink, but by and large, this was not some chamber of horrors like people, will describe it. Certainly not at first look. Once detectives and officers started searching further, that's when they found out the actual horror was in that apartment.
The story of this macabre killer begins 30 years before his arrest. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May the 21st, 1960. The family moved to Iowa before settling in Ohio in 1966.
He lived with his parents who were constantly, as he put it, at each other's throats. His mother appeared to have been, this raging bundle of neurotic behavior. The parents were constantly fighting and screaming over it. And, Dahmer himself, evidently, throughout much of his early life, was completely ignored by both of them, were so caught up in their own psychological turmoil.
Jeffrey Dahmer never really made close social links with any of his peers. He was a little bit odd. And if you speak to his school friends at the time, he didn't seem to have a lot of empathy for other children. So when children would fall over in the playground or get hurt or cry, he didn't appear to be affected by that and would sometimes laugh at them. So something wasn't quite right with a young Jeffrey Dahmer.
Feeling ostracized by his family and classmates, Dahmer spent a lot of time playing alone in the woods surrounding his Ohio home.
Well, he had a really morbid curiosity with death from quite a young age, and this started with a fairly innocent insect collection, and he would keep the bodies of insects inside jars full of chemicals. This soon progressed. He would go fishing, and he was interested in what the fish looked like on the inside, so he would chop up the fish to have a look at this.
Dahmer took his fish and cut it open. He was fascinated with the inside of the fish. And one of his little friends asked him, "Jeffrey, what are you doing?" And he said, "Just look at it."
And this, escalates, to the point that it's, he's apparently killing stray dogs and, decapitating them.
One of the young boys in the neighbourhood was walking in the woods behind Dahmer's house when Dahmer was a teenager, and he came across the body of a dead dog, and it was mutilated and it was nailed to a tree.
So there's some early interest in animal anatomy that blossoms into this very, very dark obsession, and then somehow becomes tangled up with his own sexuality.
Dahmer continued to struggle to fit in at high school and turned to alcohol from a young age.
Well, Dahmer started drinking when he was at school. One of his former classmates remembered that he used to come in with a cup, and he didn't have tea or coffee in this cup. He had Scotch whiskey in it. So this was quite a disturbing behaviour for a teenager.
There's a thought that in hindsight, you ask why more people didn't try to intervene. You've got a kid coming drunk to school. But back in the 70s, when Dahmer's coming to school intoxicated, nobody thinks, gee, we better make sure we take care of this, because what if he turns out to be a serial killer?
In the summer of 1978, Dahmer's parents finally divorced.
The breakdown of Jeffrey Dahmer's parents' marriage was quite a tough time for him. His parents were at each other's throats. It was not an amicable divorce at all, and each of them was forcing him to side with them. So he felt very much torn between his parents. So this was a real source of conflict for him. And I think at this time, children often who have these experiences will retreat into themselves. They will preoccupy themselves with things that they're interested in and will lose themselves in their own fantasy world. And I think that's very much what happened with Dahmer.
Having just recently graduated from high school, Dahmer soon had no one around him at all.
Well, in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18. His mother had gone away with his younger brother, and his father was living in a hotel. So he's alone, and he's ruminating, and he's fantasizing, and things are going to take a turn for the worse quite soon after this.
On June the 18th, 1978, Dahmer's fantasy world collided with the real one when he pulled over to pick up a 19-year-old hitchhiker called Stephen Hicks.
Dahmer picked him up and invited him back to his house to have some drinks and I guess maybe smoke some dope.
They were in the basement of his parents' home. They had had sex, and then Stephen Hicks wanted to leave. And that was when Dahmer just wanted so badly to have company. It sounds like such a textbook psychological thing, abandonment syndrome, but this was at the heart of what made him so needy for company.
And then when the guy said he wanted to leave, Dahmer clubbed him on the back of the head with a barbell and then strangled him, then ultimately disposed of the body, removed all the flesh, and eventually dissolved it in acid and pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer.
This is a really, really brutal crime. And he disposes of the body parts in the woods behind his house. And that's a really symbolic place for Jeffrey Dahmer, because this is a place where he's dismembered animals before, where he's displayed mutilated dogs on tree trunks. So we're seeing that this place is special to him.
Dahmer had experienced taking the life of another human for the first time.
I think that the first murder is a real milestone for Jeffrey Dahmer. So he knows now that he's capable of this. He knows that he's capable of taking someone else's life. So it's not just a fantasy anymore, it's now a reality. He's gone from harming animals to harming people, and he's not going to stop.
He's not desperate, but he becomes accustomed to it. He becomes ready to kill again, and just kill and kill and kill and kill until he gets caught.
But it wasn't until 13 years later, in August 1991, that Dahmer was finally apprehended after one of his potential victims escaped from his Milwaukee apartment. Once in custody, Dahmer confessed to killing 17 young men and boys. The man whose job it was to prosecute the relentless killer was Milwaukee District Attorney Mike McCann.
The word evil doesn't come up very often. It just doesn't. Guilty, not guilty. Did he do it, didn't he do it? Culpability, yes. But not often evil, because evil is almost a moral issue. That word came up with Dahmer. You couldn't help see what he did. Innocent people, strangers, to take for a couple of hours of sex, to take a human being's life. That's so evil, so evil.
Dahmer's case made headlines across the world after the details of his grisly confession were leaked.
A New York Times reporter compromised the integrity of a worker at our building and got a copy of the confession. It was a detailed 38-page confession, so the details of the gory things he had done, again, captured people's interest. So that's how it rapidly became a matter of intense interest.
The confession outlined the life of a deranged serial killer. After murdering Stephen Hicks and desecrating his body in 1978, Dahmer didn't kill again for 9 years. After dropping out of Ohio State University after just one semester, he was spending most of his days drinking until his father urged him to enlist in the US Army.
The alcohol continued as a theme when he joined the army and he moved to Germany. One of his former colleagues remembers him just sitting in his room drinking gin all day long, not even leaving his room to eat. So there was a real dependency on alcohol.
In 1981, 21-year-old Dahmer was discharged from the army after his drinking rendered him incapable of serving. After spending a month sleeping rough on the beaches of Florida, he returned to Ohio. But his father had had enough and shipped him off to start a new life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
He was sent to live with his grandmother, who was the one adult apparently he had, something approaching, a normal affection for. I was there. He really embarked on this career of horror.
By 1986, Dahmer had been arrested a couple of times for exposing himself in public, once in front of a group of children. The hopeless alcoholic had managed to find work at a local chocolate factory in Milwaukee and was frequenting gay bars and bathhouses.
I think being homosexual affected Dahmer in two ways. Firstly, it was a source of shame for him because it was quite a stigmatized social identity at the time. But also, it enabled him an opportunity when it came to his killing behaviour. So, being homosexual at this time, it was something that happened in the shadows, it was something that happened underground, and this was the ideal place for someone like him to go hunting.
It was this exposure to the gay scene that seemed to reawaken the dark sexual urges inside of him. And by September 1987, over 9 years since the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer was ready to kill again.
His idea was to drug people and keep them with him so that they wouldn't answer back to him, they wouldn't argue with him, they wouldn't fight him, they would stay with him. That's what he wanted. He wanted companionship. So he would go to the bars on Milwaukee's near South Side, and he would have conversations with people in these bars. And when he was talking to these people, these prospective victims, he would say, "So what was it like when you came out? How was your family about it?" So if your response was, "Oh, my family has been great, they're so supportive, I'm very close to my parents," that person wasn't going to be a victim. But if the person answered, "My parents aren't speaking to me anymore. I'm estranged from my family. I'm kind of on my own now," that was the perfect victim for Jeffrey Dahmer because he wanted to choose people who wouldn't be missed.
Between September 1987 and March 1988, Dahmer killed 3 men, the youngest a 14-year-old boy who he paid to pose for nude photographs before drugging and strangling him to death. He would dissolve the bodies in acid.
He cleverly developed a program to destroy the bodies, to get rid of the bodies, left no evidence. This was a very clever killer, very clever killer.
Dahmer would dissolve his victims, presumably to make it easier to dispose of them. Dissolving tissue and chemicals can certainly interfere with identifying it as human tissue. It'll interfere with DNA. You're really left predominantly with skeletal remains to try and identify features such as age, sex, race.
Dahmer murdered 2 of the victims at his grandmother's house where he was living.
His grandmother became aware that he was bringing these young guys back to her house. I mean, she thought for gay sex. Obviously, she had no inkling of the atrocities he was committing on their bodies, although she was complaining also about a foul odor that she noticed.
On September the 25th, 1988, Dahmer moved into his own apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee and didn't wait long before attacking again. The very next day, September the 26th, he enticed a 13-year-old boy back to his home and drugged him.
One of the methods that Dahmer used to subdue his victims was to use benzodiazepines, the same family of drugs as Valium. He put them in drinks that would make you woozy, sleepy, and then eventually go unconscious.
Dahmer sexually assaulted the boy, but somehow, possibly due to Dahmer passing out drunk, the 13-year-old escaped and went to the police. In January 1989, he was convicted of sexual assault, but the sentencing was delayed until May, during which time an unrelenting Dahmer, unbeknownst to the authorities, managed to claim a fifth victim. The 29-year-old served 10 months in prison, but when he was released in March 1990, he picked up right where he left off.
So Jeffrey Dahmer really did ramp up his offending. The scale and the nature of his behaviour became all the more grotesque. So he wasn't just killing people, dismembering them, and then disposing of their bodies. He started to do some really bizarre things.
He was in the process of constructing some hideously diabolical shrine in his bedroom out of the skulls and skeletons of some of his victims. It's almost as though some bizarre, archaic thing had broken through and he was performing or creating some sort of ancient, human sacrificial temple in this little Milwaukee apartment.
In 1990, Dahmer killed another 4 young men. His MO was becoming more and more polished.
He would offer his victims money to go back to his apartment with him to take pictures, nude photographs of them, and then perhaps to have sex. Every single one of his victims went with him willingly. He would offer them a drink, and once he found out what they wanted to drink, he kept a lot of things on hand, different kinds of alcohol, and that's when he would put a drug in it that would put them to sleep, or that would relax them so that they would pass out.
They would pass out. He would then have sex with them while they were passed out, do with them as he wished, but of course they couldn't do to him. Then as they approached recovery, coming out of it, he would strangle them to death.
It seemed as though Dahmer got a thrill, not from the murder, but from the dead bodies of his victims.
Dahmer liked necrophilia. He liked sex with unconscious people. He wasn't a slasher in the sense that he took delight in killing. His purpose was sex with these people, company with these people. That's hard to believe.
He would commit necrophiliac sex acts on the corpses, dismember the corpses, dissolve parts of the bodies in these vats of acid he had, keep certain organs in his refrigerator, some of which he would actually cannibalize.
Dahmer said that the cannibalism that he engaged in was born out of a curiosity. He wanted to find out, first of all, what that would be like. He also said that there was an element of wanting to make these people a part of him, so they would be with him forever.
Dahmer, from the beginning, was driven by this terror of being alone. He said he killed his first victim, Stephen Hicks, when Hicks said he had to go, and Dahmer didn't want to be alone. There's some desire, which is part of normal sexuality. You love somebody, somebody will say, "Oh, I love you so much, I want to eat you up." With normal people, that's obviously metaphorical, but it does express some desire to be so close to the person that you want to incorporate them into, you want to merge with them. With somebody like Dahmer, that becomes this very literal horror.
And the horror only became worse when Dahmer began experimenting with his semi-conscious victims.
He would drill holes in their skulls and put muriatic acid inside to see if he could get them to a zombie state so that he could keep them alive and subservient to him.
It's essentially an amateur version of attempting to perform a lobectomy or a lobotomy, but it would be an incredibly unpleasant and damaging thing to do to someone's brain. If you affect the frontal lobes, you will affect personality, potentially make somebody docile. If he's less accurate, you could essentially cause a stroke that could cause paralysis, speech problems. It really very much depends on which part of the brain is actually damaged.
But, of course, that didn't work, and his victims died one after another. Hearing about that is the stuff of horror movies. And the fact that it was happening in a city where we were known for manufacturing and beer and a very good Midwestern work ethic, tight families, this isn't the kind of thing that happens here.
In May 1991, 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer was in his killing prime. He'd already murdered 11 men and had begun collecting bones and skulls from his victims and cannibalizing their organs. What would have been a nightmare for most was a fantasy for him, and he carefully went about his killings under the radar of the police and the people of Milwaukee.
Jeffrey Dahmer had a job in a local chocolate factory, and I think for him it enabled him to maintain a facade of normality. He was just an average Joe, a regular guy who went to work every day.
I think he killed so many people without being caught because of the fact that he looked like everyone else. He did what successful serial killers do. He blended. They blend in with society. Now, he was a Caucasian male living in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, but he didn't talk to anybody. He didn't bother anybody. He was barely someone people noticed. Barely noticed. He also was targeting people who, he found out, might not be missed.
For most people, if they were to commit the type of acts that Jeffrey Dahmer did, they would no way be able to function normally. But Jeffrey Dahmer was not most people. He hasn't got the same level of repulsion and shock at dead bodies or mutilated bodies that most of us have. It was just another aspect of his life.
It was not known that we had a serial slayer loose in our city. We did not know because he was so cleverly disposing of the bodies. The families were reporting the sons were missing, but the police were not finding bodies. And not infrequently, young men, something happens in their life, they just up and leave town. That happens enough that the police don't get worried. If it's a woman, they'll immediately commit resources to investigate, but the young men, they don't.
But on May the 26th, 1991, Dahmer came agonizingly close to capture after an encounter with a 14-year-old boy.
Dahmer had taken Konarak Synthesymphone, a young Asian male who he found attractive. He met him in the mall, offered him money to go back to his apartment. He went, and he began to work the ritual. Dahmer would drug him, and then he began the process of this crude lobotomy, and he had drilled a hole in this young man's head. He took a break. He ran out to get more beer. While he was gone, Konarak ran out of the apartment. He was naked, he was completely dazed, and he was running up the alley next to Dahmer's apartment building. A woman in another apartment building saw him running up the alley and said, "There's a boy running up the alley, something's going on," and then these women called the police.
And then Dahmer appeared, and again, this is another remarkable characteristic of these psychopaths, is that they have an ability to maintain, a kind of coolness under the most extraordinarily high-pressured circumstances.
So he walked up to the officers, "Good evening, officers." He's very polite, he's sober, and he said, "This is my boyfriend. He came to stay with me. We had a little bit too much to drink, and he ran out of the house." He said, "How old is he?" Dahmer said, "He's 19. And the officers said, "Okay, well, just to make sure, let's all walk back up to the apartment together."
The cops went in and looked around. They even peeked into the bedroom where there was a decomposing corpse of one of Dahmer's previous victims, but, they took such a cursory look at it that they didn't even notice it.
Assuming the couple were having a lover's tiff, the two police officers left Konarak alone with Dahmer in the apartment building. And in the early hours of the morning, he murdered the 14-year-old boy. An opportunity to catch the killer had been missed.
I think that really speaks volumes about the attitudes of the police at the time in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of young people, in terms of the gay community, and that was another victim that could potentially have been saved. So there's this terrible thing going on behind closed doors and people just aren't seeing it. People aren't wanting to see it. Even the police are not joining up the dots and finding out what's really going on. So this is allowed to just bubble away and get worse.
After evading capture, Dahmer was free to continue.
There was two sides, really, to Dahmer's pleasure that he got from killing his victims. So he was a sadist who enjoys the pain and suffering of other people. And with sadists, that thrill ends when the victim dies. But Dahmer was also something of a necrophiliac who was interested in having corpses around and doing things with those corpses. And that means that the thrill starts with death. So he has this continuous fulfillment going on. And he's always fully in control. And I think that's what's really at the root of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's power and it's control, and it's the feeling that he has all this knowledge about what he's done and nobody else quite knows what he's up to.
By July 1991, Dahmer's desire to kill had become insatiable. In just 16 days, he murdered 4 more men, bringing his total number of victims to 17. But Dahmer's reign of terror was about to come to an end. On July the 22nd, he met a man called Tracy Edwards.
While they were together in the apartment, Dahmer threw a handcuff on him. This was now the beginning of his ritual. Dahmer had taken photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment, Polaroids. And those were sitting on the dresser inside the bedroom. They weren't sitting out in the main living room, but there was some speculation that Tracy Edwards had perhaps seen that. And he ran out of the apartment in his underwear, ran down the street, and when he saw the police car, Tracy Edwards has said his intention was just to get the handcuff off. That's all he wanted. He stopped these cops to say, hey, can you just get this off of me? So he stopped, and the officers start talking to him about what he saw, and then they said, well, we should probably check this out. Let's all go back to the apartment. Dahmer answered, and the minute he saw that it was the police, he tried to shut the door on them. The police pushed the door open a bit. They started struggling with him, and then finally, he just gave in. And that was when Dahmer was officially finished. He was finished killing, and he knew that he was finished.
The police officers immediately arrested Dahmer after finding the remains of some of his victims in his apartment.
They saw the body parts, and then one of the officers said he heard a scream. Then he realized later he was the one who screamed when he saw the body. So they knew they were dealing with a very serious offense. Dahmer did not resist, a little slight resistance, but Dahmer was taken into custody, and the investigation was initiated.
What followed was an incredible media circus on Dahmer's doorstep, as unbelievable stories about what was being uncovered inside his apartment were revealed.
It was so fantastical that you think people are making it up when they're telling you the details. But as it turned out, they weren't making it up. All of the atrocities that we heard about that had happened in that apartment really did happen.
The medical examiner who was called to the scene didn't know what was happening. It was so strange. There was a freezer there, bodies, parts in the freezer, called in a hazmat crew. Well, our television stations cover the police radio. When they hear that, they dispatch crews there. The first day was local television, second day, national television. By the third day, it was international television.
They were able to show video of these items coming out of the front door of this apartment building that's not usual at a crime scene. We saw a large blue barrel in which we know that Jeffrey Dahmer was trying to dissolve body parts. They had a refrigerator that was holding skulls and also was holding body parts. So these were coming down the stairs, and people were just incredulous to watch it. When I wrote the story for the Milwaukee Journal that morning, and it was released in the paper about 8 o'clock, I think, in the morning. Normally we were an afternoon paper, but we went out early with it because it was such an incredible story.
But no one quite knew the enormity of the crimes until Dahmer confessed to detectives at the local police station.
When I've spoken to the detectives that were working this case, they have said this was not a great whodunit. This would have been a whodunit if Jeffrey Dahmer hadn't confessed to everything.
When Dahmer was arrested, there were already a number of bodies in his quarters. He gave full confessions to the police, detailing his involvement in 16 separate slayings. Most of the time, he did not know the name of the victims.
When Dahmer remembered a crime that he might not have shared with the detectives, he would have the jail call them, whether it was the middle of the night or the middle of the day, and say, I remembered something else, please come over. Dahmer had said he wanted to make sure that he didn't forget anything because he wanted those families to have closure. I'm not sure about that. That may be giving Jeffrey Dahmer more credit than he is deserved, but he did claim to want to try and remember so that all of those families would have closure.
One of the interesting things about Dahmer that does differentiate him from other killers of his breed is that he did seem to be capable of a certain degree of remorse and certainly recognized the extent of his depravity.
Although he confessed to killing 16 people in the state of Wisconsin, Dahmer was first charged with 4 counts of murder on the 25th of July 1991, and a further 11 counts were added in August. The following month, investigators in Ohio found teeth and bone fragments belonging to Stephen Hicks in the woods near Dahmer's family home. A preliminary hearing was set for January 1992. His legal team were going to argue that the killings were the work of a madman.
The issue wasn't going to be, did he do it or not? The issue was going to be, was he sane or insane when he did it? And his hope was that at least in even one of the cases, he could induce the jury to believe that he was insane. Under those circumstances, he would be sentenced not to a prison, but to a mental health facility. People would say to me, Mike, this guy killed 16 people. He was drinking their blood, eating parts of their body. He must have been crazy. It sounds like he's crazy to say that, but that's not what the insanity rule is.
The city wanted justice. They wanted to see the man the press were calling the Milwaukee Cannibal locked away in prison for the horrific crimes he had committed. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer would be one of the biggest in the history of not just Wisconsin, but the entire USA.
My reaction to it then was the same reaction I think that everybody who lived in Milwaukee had when they heard about the case. No, it can't be. This is Milwaukee. Those kinds of things don't happen here. This is the Midwest. This is a very nice place.
The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on the 30th of January 1992. Anne had a front row seat.
The courtroom was an odd spectacle because court TV was still new in the game back then. And the idea that you would come to court and you'd be on television was still kind of new to people. It was the kind of media attention to a trial that Milwaukee hadn't seen in a very, very long time, if ever. I can remember so clearly the first time Jeffrey Dahmer's initial appearance in court when he walked in. I think the real fear that people had when they first saw Jeffrey Dahmer was that he looked like everybody else. He was a good-looking young man, and he is not the person that you would look at and say, stay away from that guy.
It would be up to Milwaukee DA Mike McCann to attempt to prove that Dahmer was sane and responsible for his actions.
Guilty wasn't going to be an issue, but we wanted the jury to know enough about the facts, and so the defense, to say, all right, what really happened here? How atrocious was it? How planned was it? How was he behaving? What skills were involved? He couldn't control himself.
It was a lot to take in because the testimony was so graphic. We all knew Mike McCann. He was a religious man, and we've seen him in court. He's a good attorney. But the kinds of things that he was reciting out of the criminal complaint and the confession were unheard of. These things were unheard of, and they happened right here in our city.
He did it quietly. He concealed the bodies, cleverly concealed, destroyed the bodies, planned it well, laid in the equipment, got the drugs that he used. No one that he worked with thought he was insane. The way he conducted himself was in a way that it seemed that he was sane, and that's what we wanted to get across to the jury.
Mike employed the help of psychiatry expert Dr. Philip Resnick.
The more bizarre the crimes, such as involving cannibalism, the more the lay public wants to think that guy had to be out of his mind. But in looking at it from the actual strict definition of insanity, generally the diseases of paraphilias, like necrophilia, where someone has trouble controlling themselves, are not viewed, for the most part, as diseases which qualify for insanity because of the social implications. One of the points that I made as a consultant is, even if you have necrophilia, and even if you have trouble controlling your impulse, the majority of necrophiliacs will select a setting where they can accomplish this without homicide. So some become assistants in morgues or assistants in pathology labs where they may have access to dead victims. Others will actually disinter bodies after they're buried so that one does not have to actually kill to exercise the necrophilia's impulse, and that's one of the reasons I felt that he didn't qualify for insanity.
The trial was essentially a debate between specialist psychiatrists about the mental state of Dahmer, who sat watching the whole thing play out over 2 weeks.
Dahmer was very calm in court. When you talk of you assessing a person by what you see, no one studying him would believe he was insane. He was he was watching what was going on. He wasn't reacting in any negative way. He conducted himself in a very rational way, a very proper way.
This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick.
On February 15th, the jury had reached a verdict on Dahmer's sanity.
Someone like Dahmer comes along who has never been in a psychiatric hospital and alleges insanity. Juries are going to be skeptical of it, and then when it's all in the form of his sexual drive rather than a traditional psychosis where someone's out of touch with reality and he's taking careful steps to cover his tracks, it's very difficult to succeed with insanity with that type of case.
Jeffrey Dahmer was ruled to be sane by the jury. On February 17, 1992, Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced him to life imprisonment for each of the 15 counts against him.
When the verdict was announced in court, there was a great shout from the gallery, especially from the victims' families that cried.
I was pleased in the sense, happy, not exuberant, but happy that this danger was removed from our community, that the jury had not been hoodwinked, that the jury realized this chap was not insane.
The state of Wisconsin does not have the death penalty, but Dahmer would have to serve a minimum of 936 years. He was immediately sent to the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage. 3 months later, on the 1st of May 1992 in Ohio, Dahmer was also found guilty of murdering Stephen Hicks in 1978 and given yet another life sentence.
Dahmer always said that he was compelled to kill, that they were urges. He said, I had urges that I could not control. He also said that even though he was in prison, he was relieved that the killing was done. He still had the urges. They didn't go away. He was just in a place where he couldn't act on them.
Locked away for the rest of his life, Dahmer found comfort in the Bible. And by 1994, he decided to get baptized. The prison called on local minister Roy Ratcliffe.
So I was quite surprised to be escorted to a little room and left alone. And then Jeff comes to the room and he closes the door, and then there's he and I sitting together across the table. And I'm thinking for a moment, wow, I'm in a room with a man who's killed several people. So yeah, that was a little bit disconcerting. But I was there for a purpose and for a reason, so I wanted to find out what was going on and to see what I could do to help. So my fears were set aside primarily because of my focus on what I was trying to do. Jeff was a normal guy, courteous, very respectful to me. When we shook hands, I noticed his hands were rather small. Looking at his hands and thinking, wow, these are the hands that strangled people, these are the hands that murdered people, these are the hands that dismembered people.
On May the 10th, 1994, the same day that notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy was executed, Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized in a prison bathtub.
Then the door opens, and I walk into the room, and Jeff had already crawled into the tub, and the only thing that was above the water was just simply his head. And so I baptized you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit for the forgiveness of your sins, and pushed his head down under. And then when he came back up, I said something I often say to people when I baptize them. I said, "Welcome to the family of God." He said, "Well, thank you very much."
But just 6 months after his baptism on November the 28th, 1994, Dahmer and another convicted murderer, Jesse Anderson, were attacked and killed by a fellow inmate.
Christopher Scarver took a barbell, went into the bathroom, and beat both Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson to death. There were a number of people who felt that Jeffrey Dahmer got exactly what he deserved. When I called his mother, she said, "Well, now everybody got what they want. The monster is dead." And then she said, "He was my son. He was my boy."
It was a terrible, terrible death in that sense there. But for some people, it was a relief. They were glad because all they could think about are the crimes he committed. They're not thinking about what I'm thinking about is here's a person who's trying to serve God as best as he can, and now his life is being taken from him.
I mean, some people see some sort of poetic symmetry in the fact that Dahmer's first murder was the one in which he bludgeoned the teenage hitchhiker Stephen Hicks to death with a barbell, and that he himself died in a very, very similar way.
The apartment on North 25th Street that housed Dahmer's macabre collection of victims' remains and where 12 young men lost their lives was demolished in November 1992. But Dahmer's twisted legacy has been impossible to wipe out. He has become one of the most infamous serial killers in the world.
I think of Dahmer as sort of like the flip side of somebody like Mozart. How do you account for somebody creating that kind of music? Ultimately, how do you account for somebody who is luring young men to his apartment and drilling holes in their skull and injecting brains with muriatic acid to turn them into zombies? There's something there ultimately inexplicable.
Jeffrey Dahmer committed some of the most evil acts that I have ever written about or heard about or seen on a television show because they were real. I don't know if he was sane or insane because that's not my training to figure that out, but I can absolutely say that he did some of the most evil acts known to man.
Dahmer's crimes would not feel out of place in a perverse horror movie. He was a man who killed to satisfy his unhealthy sexual perversions, keeping parts of his victims' skeletons as trophies and eating their organs. Jeffrey Dahmer truly is the stuff of nightmares and unquestionably one of the world's most evil killers. On August the 31st, 1985, detectives across California had finally discovered the identity of a serial killer who the media had dubbed the Night Stalker. The mysterious attacker was wanted for 13 murders across Los Angeles.
He was a psychotic, paranoid, Satan-worshipping psychopath who derived his pleasure from the combination of lust and violence.
After being chased by a mob of vigilantes, 25-year-old Richard Ramirez had to be rescued by 2 police officers who had inadvertently made the biggest arrest of the decade.
This one cop looks real close. He's, Jesus, it's the Night Stalker. It's Richard Ramirez.
At his trial, the most feared man in the USA declared his allegiance to the devil.
If you were going to set out to describe how to make a serial killer and a serial rapist, you could do worse than take Ramirez as your example. He has every possible constituent.
Richard Ramirez, the man known as the Night Stalker, had taken his place in infamy as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a series of gruesome murders that spread fear across California. When Richard Ramirez was finally apprehended by an angry mob in Los Angeles on August the 31st, 1985, it brought to an end one of the most prolific murderers in US history. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, the Satan-worshipping serial killer had terrorized the state of California for 14 months, claiming at least 13 victims. San Francisco detective Frank Falzon met Ramirez face-to-face 4 years after his conviction in September 1989.
About as evil as anything I can imagine. He was intent to hurt, and that's what people have to realize.
Frank worked hard to help capture Ramirez after the Night Stalker murders reached the San Francisco Bay Area in August 1985.
I served 22 years in the San Francisco homicide detail. Numerous cases were broke that I felt very good about. None as high as the Night Stalker. The fact that my partner and I and a few other gentlemen played a key role in breaking this case, it was probably the highlight of my career.
This killer's story begins over half a century ago. Richard Ramirez was born on February the 29th, 1960, to Mexican-born parents in El Paso, Texas.
He was the youngest of 5 children, and the family had quite a kind of turbulent life. So they lived in several different areas, many of which had quite high levels of industrial pollution. Some of his siblings had been born with birth defects. So this family had an awful lot of challenges. That's something that would come to shape Richard's life and those of his siblings. So he hasn't got the best start in life.
And life did not get much better for Ramirez. At a young age, he began rebelling against his strict Catholic upbringing.
He's 9, his brain is still developing, he's sniffing glue, he's smoking marijuana, there's emotional trauma that's happening in the family too.
His father was a brutal, short-tempered man. I'm not suggesting it was classic child abuse, but there was certainly physical violence. And Richie Ramirez shrank away, if you like, from his father. And he took refuge in the company of a cousin.
Ramirez's cousin, Mike, returned from the Vietnam War in 1971. He was scarred by the atrocities he'd seen and had committed as a Special Forces Green Beret.
So we have a grizzled, damaged Vietnam vet, Mike, and a frail, probably suggestible boy. And Mike proceeds to explain to him the dreadful things he's done to Vietnamese women while in Vietnam. He's tied them to trees, he's raped them, he's beheaded them, he's taken photographs of it.
He came home telling stories of this to Richard, and he would boast about it. So Richard now has a real-life killing machine to look up to and to admire.
12-year-old Ramirez was fascinated by his older cousin.
So he starts spending an awful lot of time with Mike. He's quite a significant influence on young Richard's life, and he's very impressionable at this age. So this really is kind of cementing some of those ideas that he's had about harming other people in order to feel powerful.
And that must have distorted Ramirez's value systems and the way in which he responded to women in general. They became objects, they were not real, and they became, how can one put it politely, not entirely human.
On May the 4th, 1973, Ramirez witnessed an event that would cement his feelings towards women and his admiration for cousin Mike.
He keeps his gun in the fridge because he says he likes to keep it cool. And this is another thing I think that quite impresses Richard. And one day Mike has a huge argument with his wife and ends up killing her. He shoots her in the face. And Richard is there in the house when this happens. What you've got here is a combination of things that have been going on. So a young lad who looks up to people who are violent, a young lad who hears stories of violence, and now he's actually seeing it happen.
Mike was a powerful influence in the direction of psychopathy, rage discontrol, and the merger, and this is the most important thing, the merger of sexual impulses and violent impulses into a single coherent force.
Now, the impact that must have had on a boy who's been taking marijuana with a man who he clearly hero worships, it must have scrambled Ramirez's brain.
And his reaction to it is quite interesting, because when he talks about it afterwards, he doesn't talk about how he feels seeing this woman murdered in front of him. He talks about it very objectively. He talks about the body falling to the floor, about blood spurting out of the wound. It's not about feeling disgusted or feeling traumatized or sad. He's just giving a very cold description. And I think this really does tell us what kind of person Ramirez is turning into.
Mike was immediately arrested. In court, he was judged to be not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Instead of prison, he was sent to a mental institution and released in 1977.
Ramirez, in the meantime, because he's removed from his hero, goes to stay with his sister and husband.
He's lost his idol, he's lost his role model, and he is basically now starting to ruminate and to think about the things that he wants to do. So he doesn't look after himself, he's very unkempt, he's dirty, he doesn't wash, and so he becomes even more of an outcast. So he very much gets lost in his own head at this point in time, and he's planning what he's going to do next.
Age 17, Ramirez was ready to turn his twisted fantasies into reality.
While he was still at school, he got a job working at a Holiday Inn, and he got a pass key for all the rooms. And he took it upon himself one day to decide that while the husband was away parking the car, he would go into the room that they just both moved into and he would attempt to rape the wife.
The husband comes in and he sees what's going on and basically beats Richard Ramirez to a bloody pulp. But this couple, they're from out of town, they're on holiday. They don't want to follow this up. They don't want to pursue this case.
The couple decided not to press charges. It was a lucky escape for Ramirez. Living on the edges of society, his behavior became more and more unpredictable.
So he's dirty, he's unkempt, he's sleeping in graveyards, he's increasingly kind of going over to the dark side. And the things that appeal to him are things that most people would find really odd and really bizarre, devil worship, that sort of thing. So he's gone on this trajectory now, and I think that's only going to go one way.
Aged 18, Richard Ramirez headed west to California. The Golden State would become his hunting ground. 5 years later, in June 1984, he would claim the first murder victim of a 14-month killing spree. Anyone was a target, and everyone was petrified. Where would Ramirez strike next? By 1984, Richard Ramirez had become a social outcast. Fueled by a hatred of women and a distinct lack of morals, the 24-year-old had settled into a life on the fringes of society in downtown Los Angeles.
He's with all the runaways and the throwaways. He's immersed in a drug subculture. So he had no brakes on him before, really, but now he's completely off the rails, and he does become Richard Ramirez, the serial killer.
On June the 28th, 1984, 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found brutally stabbed to death in her Los Angeles home. Her dress was pulled up, suggesting a sexual assault had taken place. The knife wounds were so severe, she had almost been decapitated. Ramirez's reign of terror had begun.
In terms of what made Richard Ramirez kill, I think it was an escalation of behaviour. So he's been robbing, he's been burglarising people's houses, he has got access to people in their homes. And I think when you have that access and an opportunity presents itself, and you are the type of person who gets off on violence, who doesn't feel bad about hurting other people, then you are somebody who is likely to take advantage of that opportunity when it presents itself. So I think it's a gradual escalation of behaviour.
6 months after his first murder, Ramirez was in custody, but not for murder. He was arrested on a charge of car theft. He served 36 days in prison, but it was his mugshot, captured on December the 12th, 1984, that would eventually lead to his downfall. Once released on March the 17th, 1985, his killing spree continued. Ramirez attacked 3 women on the same night, killing 2 of them. The attack seemed completely random, but appeared to have a sexual motive.
Well, Ramirez had as a specific part of his modus operandi to gain access to his victims essentially by surreptitiously entering their home. He was at his core a burglar whose object felony was sexual murder.
He's not someone who can form relationships with women, but he still wants women. He still wants to possess them and have his way with them. So he's only going to do that through violent means.
11 days later, Ramirez was on the hunt once more. He broke into the home of 64-year-old Vincent Zazara and his wife Maxine in the city of Whittier. Ramirez shot Vincent in the head, killing him instantly.
Then tied up his wife, who was 20 years younger, Maxine, demanding money. Where did she keep the valuables?
One of the things Ramirez would do would be he would restrain his victims. That's obviously got a physical impact. It means you can't move. It means you're not able to respond to an assailant. And obviously there's the psychological element of helplessness and powerlessness.
Ramirez shot her 3 times. And then he mutilated her, grotesquely, eventually gouging her eyes out and putting them in a jewellery box to take away with him.
Post-mortem mutilation is relatively uncommon in homicide cases. Most homicides that are dealt with day to day are cases where people have been angry or where there's a domestic dispute. They're not really the sort of planned, orchestrated murders that we see in cases like Ramirez. In those cases, you can see bizarre behaviour, both to the body before death and mutilation after death, and that's very much more about what's in the mind of the killer.
Vincent Zazara was a well-respected member of the Whittier community. He ran a local pizzeria after serving in the Second World War. His son, Peter, remembers his father fondly.
Well, my dad was a immigrant from Italy, came over in the 1930s, mid-30s, something like that, and he joined the Army. He was in World War II. He was in Patton's Army. He was one of his team members. He was in the Army for 6 years. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was a pretty accomplished person that way, and everybody respected him.
Peter remembers hearing the news that his father and stepmother had been murdered.
I was at home and I got a call. He told me what had happened. And we drove up. I was living in Pico Rivera. We drove up to Whittier. And I just remember that how could it be possible? And I was just in a state of shock.
As Peter arrived at his father's house, it was surrounded by emergency service vehicles.
And he met all the police outside. We were outside the front door with my fiance at the time. And I wanted to go inside, but they wouldn't let us inside. I was already really upset. He said, one of the detectives said that it would just make me more upset than I already was.
Vincent and Maxine Zazara had become Ramirez's fourth and fifth victims. Over 30 years later, Peter is still struggling to come to terms with the murders.
It ruined my life. It was hard for me to get on with my life. I've hardly screwed my life up a lot because of it. I would be a different person, I think. We were like kindred souls because he was also a veteran, I'm a veteran, and we were just really close in a lot of ways like that. Although my dad was very, very tough on the outside, he's pretty gentle on the inside, a lot like me that way.
Over the next 4.5 months, 25-year-old Ramirez became even more prolific. Between May and August of 1985, he continued to break into houses across Los Angeles County, killing a further 8 people and attempted to kill another 4. The whole of Southern California was gripped with fear. Although each crime scene was distinct, investigators began to link them based on the ferocity of the murders.
There was no question that this is a crime really unique in its level of terror. It was unique in its level of terror for several important reasons. One, the lack of predictability about victim. You could not, as a citizen, say to yourself, I'm safe because I'm not a prostitute. Or you couldn't say, I'm safe because I live in Beverly Hills, because there was no place you were safe in. And then what made it especially terrifying is the circumstances of the murders as they took place. One, that they took place often at night in the darkness. And two, they took place in a place that you ordinarily regard as the safest place in the universe, your personal home. That made this terror beyond belief.
Ramirez's series of attacks were random and indiscriminate. Anyone could be targeted, men or women.
As far as we can tell, nothing attracted him to his victims in particular. He would often break into residences, not knowing who was in the residence, and end up, depending if it was men or women, killing them and perpetrating sexual crimes against him. Ramirez didn't have a particular age in mind. He didn't have a particular race in mind. He didn't have a particular socioeconomic status in mind. He was a man who had rampant chaotic impulses and basically attacked and killed whoever was in the room when his rage inflamed itself.
Ramirez did not appear to favor any particular method of killing. He would murder his victims by any means necessary. And that made it even harder for investigators to decide who had committed the crimes.
He would stab, he would shoot, he would stamp, he would rape, he would force himself on people orally. Really, he just seemed to revel in acts of violence and violation.
And it was quite a while before the police actually realised that they had a serial killer on their hands. So here's somebody who terrorised Los Angeles, and they didn't realise that it was the same person who was doing this till quite late on in the day.
By August the 8th, 1985, Richard Ramirez had killed 13 people in the Los Angeles area. His lust for blood was relentless.
We are a species that craves to be in a feeling state. The serial killer their brain is numb most of the time. So for them to feel, they have to do something that's the equivalent of smacking their hand. They have to create a level of arousal and intensity around them that boosts their affect range.
Despite the number of attacks in the short space of time, the police were unable to capture the man the newspapers were calling the Valley Intruder.
Well, Ramirez would have thought at this point in time that he is an accomplished predator. Because he's not getting caught, the police don't even know who he is. Not because he's brilliant at what he does, but it's because the police aren't putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Because his MO is all over the place, he's killing people using different methods, he's targeting a whole host of victim groups.
380 miles north of Los Angeles in San Francisco, Detective Frank Falzon was hoping the murders wouldn't spread any further afield.
We were hearing in San Francisco at that time about a Valley Intruder. The Valley Intruder was an individual that was breaking into homes in Southern California, predominantly the Los Angeles area, killing the husband, attacking the wife, ransacking the house, and burglarizing a lot of valuable property.
Frank had heard about the fear felt amongst the locals in LA.
Every law enforcement officer was aware, but this seemed to be a problem for the Los Angeles area. So the need for high attention in San Francisco wasn't happening.
But all that was about to change. In mid-August of 1985, Ramirez left his familiar killing ground of Los Angeles behind. The man known as the Valley Intruder was spreading his wings. Very soon, he'd have a new nickname. Every cop in California wanted to get their hands on Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. By mid-August 1985, 25-year-old Richard Ramirez had killed 13 people and attempted to murder a further 5 in the Los Angeles region of California. His random break-ins meant that anyone could be a potential victim, and his cruelty knew no bounds. He would often brutally rape and torture women. Locals were terrified.
It was a summer of extreme heat, and people were afraid to leave their doors unlocked, afraid to leave their windows open. Purchasing of guns went way up in the state of California. I would say every active police officer within the state of California was looking for Richard Ramirez. He would have been a big feather in any police officer's cap for his capture.
Ramirez, aware of the growing media spotlight on his crimes, had moved north to San Francisco. And on August the 18th, 1985, Ramirez killed outside of LA for the first time.
It was a Saturday morning. My partner, Carl Klotz, and I were the on-call homicide team, and we received a call to respond to Eucalyptus Street out by the San Francisco Zoo. There was a murder. So we responded out there, and the crime scene that we witnessed was atrocious. The husband had been shot and killed while he was asleep in bed. The wife had been removed to the San Francisco Emergency Hospital. She had been raped, shot, and left for dead. The intruder had gone into the refrigerator, eaten their food, drew satanic symbols, the pentagram on the walls in the house. He vomited after he ate their food, and then he masturbated on their carpet. Very sick crime scene, indicating a very disturbed mind.
25-year-old Ramirez had begun worshipping Satan in his late teens and would often leave pentagrams at the scene of his crimes.
Now, that is not absolutely unique to Ramirez. There are lots of serial killers who engage in Satan worship, as did Ramirez.
The shocking graffiti was not enough to immediately point investigators towards Ramirez. The unfortunate couple murdered in their San Francisco home were 66-year-old Peter and 62-year-old Barbara Pan.
Everything we found out about Barbara and Peter Pan, these were just a lovely older couple living a peaceful life, never expecting to be attacked while they were asleep in bed. Both my partner, we had seen an awful lot in our time on the police force, but we were both moved beyond normal for a homicide scene.
Frank began investigating the couple's murder, unaware that their death may be linked to California's most notorious serial killer.
That afternoon, after this initial crime scene visit, my partner and I went back to the office and we put out an all-points bulletin. This is an alert up and down the state of California regarding all the information that we had. And one of the key things that we had was that our victims were shot with a .22 revolver. And we had the slug for comparison. A very alert, active sergeant in the Glendale Police Department that was working the Valley Intruder case, a man by the name of John Perkins. John calls us and says, you might want to check the Valley Intruder. He always uses a .22 caliber revolver. That connection there put us into the Los Angeles cases. That particular day, August 18th, 1985.
After committing a murder outside the LA Valley region for the first time, the newspapers had renamed the killer the Night Stalker.
All of a sudden, the media blew this case up to be something very, very big, which it was. And now we had a link with Barbara and Peter Pan in San Francisco. So the murder count was going up every weekend. And people all over the state of California were very, very frightened.
Frank began looking into other recent crimes in the San Francisco Bay Area and found a burglary report filed by a fellow detective which had all the hallmarks of a Night Stalker break-in.
In that report, we found out that the intruder climbed through a bathroom window. They were not at home. Their young niece, I think she was 16 years old, she was home by herself. Hearing somebody come through the bathroom window, she panicked. She went downstairs and hid into a closet. Fortunately for this young lady, the intruder never found her, ransacked the house, stole a bunch of valuable jewelry.
Luckily, the homeowner had added his social security number to his wife's jewelry, just in case it was stolen. And before too long, 290 miles away, the police got a match.
The big break in the case came is when this bracelet with the serial number ends up in Lompoc, California, turned in by a confidential informant of a police sergeant on the Lompoc Police Department.
While Frank headed to Lompoc to interrogate the informant, Richard Ramirez had already left San Francisco and traveled 430 miles south to Mission Viejo. There he stole a car before carrying out another brutal attack on August the 24th, 1985. This time the victims were a young couple that were engaged to be married.
He attacked a man, shot him in the head. He was 30, he was living with his fiancée.
Ramirez raped the young woman, but she survived, and that would lead to the serial killer's undoing.
She gave the first really good description to the police of the man. But even more, and I think the telling fact, is that as he left, he said, "Tell them that you've met the Night Stalker."
Thanks to the social security number found on the bracelet, detectives in both Mission Viejo and San Francisco were now hot on the trail of the Night Stalker. Frank Falzon had tracked down a potential informant in Lompoc. Frank questioned him in the back of an unmarked car.
I said, "Your friend Rick is the Night Stalker, the man that's been killing in Los Angeles and killing in San Francisco. I don't want anybody to die this weekend. We need your help."
But the informant wasn't planning on giving up the name of the man who sold him the security tag bracelet.
So I'm not giving you nothing about my friend Rick. Do you understand me, you effing punk? I'm not giving you anything. And I could feel my blood beginning to boil. And I guess I rolled up my fist and I looked at him and he goes, "Oh, tough guy, tough guy. You want to fight me?" And he put his hands up. And I started over the top. And at that point, I don't know if I would have finished that punch or not, but I was going to hit him with everything I had. And he fell back in the seat and he threw up his arms in a cross manner and he screamed, "Richard Ramirez." When we heard that name, I literally collapsed in the front seat of the police car.
At the same time as Frank got a positive ID, detectives investigating the attack in Mission Viejo had found a fingerprint. It was in the car the Night Stalker had stolen after it was found abandoned in Los Angeles. The print belonged to Richard Ramirez. Now linked to a carjacking and his likeness matched to the photo-fit description given by a surviving victim, the net was closing in on Ramirez. On Friday, August the 30th, 1985, a mugshot on file from December 1984 was released to all media across California.
When a serial killer is moving around geographically, it's really important to enlist the aid of the media, which can get the word out, sketches and things like that, out to the public, because the public becomes an asset to you. And oftentimes, these cases are resolved by somebody recognizing the person.
The following morning, Saturday, August the 31st, 1985, Ramirez boarded a Greyhound bus in Tucson, Arizona, where he'd gone to visit his brother. He headed back to LA, unaware that he was a wanted man.
Saturday morning, Richard Ramirez's picture was front page in every newspaper in the state of California.
When he arrives back in Los Angeles, he gets off the Greyhound bus and somebody recognizes him from the picture that's been circulating in the press. And essentially, the predator now becomes the prey. Lots of people start chasing after him. And eventually, they catch up with him, and Richard Ramirez, the serial killer, is no more.
Not surprisingly, given the atmosphere in Los Angeles at the time, they attack him ferociously. Kicking him, hitting him. But he's pinned down by the locals. He's not caught by two of LA's finest or even the police department. He's caught by a group of local onlookers. A true citizen's arrest, you might say.
As the local police arrived to break up the melee, it took a bit of time to realize who they had sitting in the back of their squad car.
This one cop looks real close. He's, Jesus, it's the Night Stalker, it's Richard Ramirez. He goes out over the air and announces they have the Night Stalker in custody.
After 14 months of fear, the residents of California could rest a little easier. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was off the streets and in police custody. Now began the task of gathering evidence against the 25-year-old who was going to plead not guilty to all the charges against him. Investigators would need to work tirelessly to get a conviction. The entire state of California wanted justice served upon Richard Ramirez. On August the 31st, 1985, the man known as the Night Stalker had been charged with 13 murders and 5 attempted murders in Los Angeles County between June 1984 and August 1985. His victims ranged in age between 16 and 83. 3 were men and 15 were women. Investigators were keen to interrogate the 25-year-old devil worshipper.
Normally, when I would interview somebody, I would try to empathize with them or get them to break down emotionally about their crimes and to confess or to, admit to some wrongdoing. With a psychopath, you're not going to get that. They don't have the ability to break down emotionally. And so you have to approach interviewing a psychopath like Ramirez much differently. You have to play his game, stroke his ego, almost compliment him on his individuality and what he was able to get away with.
But despite all their efforts, detectives were getting nowhere.
Ramirez was a narcissist who believed he was omnipotent. He believed that he could fool detectives that had been, specially trained. And he believed that his ability to fool them was not simply a product of his own genius, but a product of the fact that he was aligned with, acting in conspiracy with Satan himself.
Ramirez went to trial for the murders he was known to have committed in the Los Angeles area. He was not charged for the murders he was suspected of in and around San Francisco. At a preliminary hearing on October the 24th, 1985, Ramirez pleaded not guilty to all the charges against him, and it caused an uproar in the courtroom.
On the first day he entered and held up his hand, he had a pentagram written on his hand, and he shouted out at the top of his voice, "Hail Satan." His position as Lucifer's assistant was now to be glorified in front of the world's media, and particularly the American media. He was a celebrity on the same level as Manson. He was good looking and was very aware of it, very aware of his female admirers in the court and outside, very aware that he cut a rather dramatic figure.
You can see that the courtroom is essentially a stage for him. So he wears dark sunglasses, he dresses all in black. He is this kind of pseudo-celebrity, and he really is enjoying it. He's lapping up the attention. So this is somebody who has attained a kind of celebrity status because of the awful things that he's done.
Due to the amount of work for both the prosecution and the defense, the trial did not begin until 3 years after the arrest of Ramirez. It took place in July 1988 in the LA Superior Court. The prosecution had uncovered stolen goods from many of the crime scenes that were in the possession of Ramirez at the time of his arrest. Ballistic reports had also linked the murders to the same gun belonging to Ramirez. The defense argued that all the evidence was circumstantial. There was a solid case against the killer, but nonetheless, for some of the families, the prospect of attending the trial was just too much to bear.
I was offered to go to the trial, but I didn't want to go because I didn't give a rat's ass about him. All I cared about was my dad and Maxine. And besides, I would have done something crazy because I was pretty upset. I'd have been in there for 1 minute, I'd have been arrested myself because I would have gone off. There's no way I could have done it. There's no possible way. In fact, I don't even know how people do it, to tell you the truth. I don't. Why would you want to do it? Why would you want to look at some scumbag who did something like that?
After the death of one of the jurors, the trial was halted and delayed even further. It wasn't until September 1989 that the jury had reached a verdict. But Ramirez seemed completely unflustered right up to the end.
A lot of his time at the trial was spent engaging in what I call bravado behavior. The message that he sent out throughout the course of the trial is that there's really nothing you can do to me. I'll let you have your trial. It'll have its outcome. Nothing will be changed because I will soon merge with Satan.
On September the 20th, 1989, 29-year-old Richard Ramirez was found guilty of all 43 charges against him, including 13 murders and 5 attempted murders. At a hearing on November the 7th, he was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin Prison, California. Showing complete contempt for his victims' families, he responded by saying, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Ramirez would never face trial for the attack in Mission Viejo or the San Francisco murders, although Frank Falzon did at least get to officially charge him.
He was brought to San Quentin, and the district attorney's office in San Francisco asked if we could bring him over, charge him formally on the murders of Peter and Barbara Pan. He was transported to San Francisco, our county jail. I went upstairs, I met Richard Ramirez, we booked him on 2 murder counts. After he was booked, he was being led away to a holding cell. And I'll never forget that sick look in his face. He turned around, he looked at me, and he had that smile on his face that he always gave before he lifted up his hand and showed the pentagram symbol.
Ramirez will never face trial for the murders he was thought to have committed in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was a tactical decision. Prosecutors decided they did not want to do anything that might jeopardize the death penalty case they had already successfully made against him. Despite his heinous acts, Ramirez had acquired a cult-like status. He had many adoring female fans write to him throughout his trial and during his incarceration.
Ramirez became a celebrity in his own right, and he had groupies. He had marriage proposals. He had women that wanted to come and visit him at the prison.
One woman in particular, Doreen Loy, wrote Ramirez 75 letters from 1985 through his trial. And in 1988, he proposed to her. They married in San Quentin, where he was incarcerated, in 1996.
On June the 7th, 2013, Richard Ramirez died before he could face the death penalty for his crimes. Instead, he died of complications relating to B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old. Ramirez had spent 23 years on death row after taking the lives of 13 people.
He was a truly depraved individual who had no interest or concern for anyone in his path, and they were simply fodder for his great and aggravated ego. I have and can never have anything but the greatest sympathy for them.
Just took away really everything. Everything that was important to us and our family and all that, really. Every holiday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, it's just pain. It's just a stab in the heart for me. There's no way that ever since that happened, I haven't had a Thanksgiving or a Christmas since. So that's what kind of impact we're talking about.
What do I think of Richard Ramirez? Not much. This man was a loser. Society, it was our loss that he was ever born. His death probably gave relief to so many of his surviving family members and victims that he had murdered. His death, I don't believe, was mourned by anybody except other satanic worshipers. This was a very sick person.
In a terrifying murder spree, Richard Ramirez broke into the sanctuary of people's homes and savagely took their lives for his own selfish needs. Although officially responsible for 13 murders in Los Angeles, he is likely to have claimed many more victims across California. He was a psychopathic, satanic, sexual predator who will always be remembered as one of the world's most evil killers.